This week, Kumar, Emmet, and Dana discuss Alan Moore and Jacen Burrows' Providence. Do you need to know H.P. Lovecraft's work to understand it? Separating Lovecraft's problematic personal views from his work, and more. First, help us reach our goal to unlock a new podcast about the manga Fullmetal Alchemist, The Law of Equivalent Exchange. It's a chapter-by-chapter reading of the manga, with commentary on the translation, including the sound effects, and on how creator Hiromu Arakawa masterfully put together the story of Edward and Alphonse Elric. Patrick and I have already started recording the show, and we can't wait for you to hear it. If you're a fan of Fullmetal Alchemist, one of the best manga of the 21st century, pledge now at patreon.com/deconcomics to hear The Law of Equivalent Exchange.
This is Kumar.
This is Emmet.
And this is Dana.
And this is Deconstructing Comics. Welcome to Deconstructing Comics. It's Kumar and Emmet in Melbourne. Again, not in each other's presence. Dana has fled back to Canada, so he's no longer in Shizuoka Silent Hill anymore. We're going to talk about Alan Moore's Providence today. We put this started coming out in 2015, 16, finished in 17. I've put it off for a long time for reasons we'll get to, but boy, what a time to be talking about H.P. Lovecraft. The Lovecraft Society put out a statement about his racism just, I think, a few weeks ago, saying that they support his works and not necessarily the man or whatever. I don't know, bunch of stuff, but it's just timely in some way. Anyway, so Providence. Okay, so this was kind of it's a 12-issue series by Alan Moore and Jacen Burrows. It's kind of a riff on Lovecraft in a lot of ways. I'm really diminishing it by reducing it to just that. It was kind of a sequel to two previous Alan Moore books, also published by Avatar, The Courtyard and Neonomicon. But as this started coming out, I heard people saying that you don't need to have read those. And I thought, okay, so we'll just do just this on this episode. And that was mostly true until you get to the last two issues, and then it turns out to actually be a sequel to The Courtyard and Neonomicon.
In fact, I would argue earlier than that, because the Neonomicon and Courtyard established that there are these domes being built over cities.
Yes. So.
And it turns out that that's a plot detail that relates to Color Out of Space and the events of that story.
Right. Well, this is interesting, too, because when I read Neonomicon, there are domes over the cities, and there's not a sentence or a word mentioned about them. You're just looking at these drawings of domes and like, why are these domes over the cities? This is weird, and it's never explained. And then 6 issues into Providence, there's a scene where they have the Color Out of Space where the meteor has hit the Earth, and the FBI chief is like, well, someday we may have to build domes over the cities to protect them.
Yeah.
So it's almost like, but Moore never mentioned the reason for the domes in Neonomicon. So I wonder if he was like planning way far ahead that he was going to explain this in a series that was unannounced at the time. But anyway,
can I quickly just jump in there again? There may well have been more information on that as part of his Euroth Cultures collection of stories, a collection of stories which famously Alan Moore lost half of them in the back of a taxi cab.
Right.
But I've never read the prose story, The Courtyard, which Anthony Johnston adapted for the Avatar comic, The Courtyard, with Jacen Burrows. So the story appeared in an anthology called Starry Wisdom, a tribute to H.P. Lovecraft in 1994. And that may have, in prose, established this idea of a shared Lovecraft universe where all the events of Lovecraft stories happened in this place. Mm-hmm. And Aldo Sachs is investigating a crime that's Lovecraftian, and he doesn't realize until it's too late what he's actually strayed into. And that's sort of a Lovecraftian conceit, that his fictional characters have wandered into another fiction and they don't understand the rules. And it's just a neat little short story. But from that, Providence emerges, because Providence is, again, a story about a Lovecraftian world where Lovecraftian things happen that we recognize from the stories. And it turns out that the main character, Robert Black, is assembling an account of all these events, which will be given to Lovecraft and then inspired Lovecraft stories.
Right.
And that will bring about the end of the world.
That's a great summary.
Wow.
That's about the best summary we could get, I think.
Yeah, I can't imagine anything more concise and perfect than that.
Now, but I did initially, when we started playing this episode like a year ago or more, I wanted to do a little experiment where one of us would be a control group that hasn't read any Lovecraft, and one of us would have read some. And then I thought, okay, let's actually do it as a round table, have 3 people here. Anyway, I was not planning to read any Lovecraft, but my son bought me a hardcover collection around Christmas time. So I ended up reading that simultaneously. So sometimes I would have read the story before I read the analog in the comic, or sometimes it would come after, and it's all a big mixed up jumble. And I think, Dana, you are on the end where you haven't read much Lovecraft?
I haven't, certainly not recently.
Okay.
So I just wanted to then clarify, which might be a point of interest to listeners as well. So of the 12 issues of Providence, my understanding, which I only really I had a vague suspicion, but kind of only figured it out because I happened to watch the film adaptation of Color Out of Space like 2 weeks ago, and was rereading that same issue. Or sorry, not that issue, but it's like book 5, the one you were just referring to, about the meteor coming down, which it was like, oh, this is like they're talking about the Carpenter family, right, and stuff like this. So my understanding then is that most, if not all, of the issues of Providence, the comic book, are analogs for specific Lovecraft stories. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct.
Yep. Yes, up to about issue 9 or 10, and sometimes there's like more than one story at a time. Yeah, and sometimes it's really. I actually think I think it's better to have not read any Lovecraft coming in, having read it, the stories, and coming into the book, because I think if you read the book, if you read Providence without having read any of the stories, you are stuck in the position of Robert Black, who goes around to these cities and meets these weird, upsetting people and has upsetting, sometimes horrifying things happen to him. But he doesn't understand any of it. And if you haven't read the Lovecraft stories, you're stuck in that same position. Whereas if you have read them, it kind of becomes Where's Wally? And it's a bit like the later League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, where you're, oh, look, I know who that is. And there's still a little bit of that in there, because there's a website called Facts Providence. It's a WordPress site which has a lot of annotations. It's
an excellent site, yeah.
Yeah, and I try to avoid going to it, but sometimes I would, because I'd be very confused about, they'd mention one character, some character would effectively walk by. They'd be in one panel or 2 panels. And then I was like, they never come back. And you're like, what's that guy about? And then I would find out in Facts Providence, oh, it's actually another Lovecraft character from story XYZ or whatever. So yeah, I do kind of feel like it's better going in blind, but maybe it is necessary to read The Courtyard and Neonomicon, because otherwise, when the last 2 issues especially come up, which bring back all those characters from those first 2 series, I think you're kind of blind at the end.
Regarding the kind of the first point about going in blind regarding Lovecraft's works, I have read a fair bit of Lovecraft in the past. Sometimes other comics adaptations, and sometimes just short stories, prose short stories. But I think that this is a book, and this is a book that definitely is approachable from an ignorant point of view, and I think reading it through with that, sharing that perspective of Robert Black, where you're equally witless or nearly as witless as he is about just what's going on, it really is quite I think a good experience in terms of being able to feel the unease and also even sometimes maybe disagreeing with the way that Black responds to things. He's very much in denial about a lot of stuff that he sees. Like, oh, I must have fainted. It's like, no, that was a demon chasing you. But after you kind of have that experience, this comic book rewards that knowledge as well. So whether you start with that knowledge or not, being able to kind of go back to this book and pick it apart as like a puzzle of like, oh, this is that. And like I actually, when I was rereading it, kind of found myself stopping, flipping over to Google and looking up stuff. Like, for example, there's this scene in book 3. Black, I think, is where he meets what's the guy, the Boggs guy that runs the gold refinery. This is the issue with all the fish people and stuff. Yeah. Anyway, they're walking down the street, and there is a swastika on the sidewalk.
Right.
And they're like, oh, what? And now, for those people who may not know, this is set between the two world wars. Like, it runs from like what from 1919 to 1922 or something. Well, actually it goes well beyond that, but the main part of the story is it covered over about 1 year maybe,
or 6 months even, or something like that.
Yeah, it may not, could even be less than a year. So it's very interesting when they encounter this swastika, because they haven't heard of Nazis yet.
Yes.
But of course, the swastika, or I think Boggs calls it a fillfoot, and that comes from I think maybe it might even be a Celtic word or something. Anyway, I kind of researched it a little bit, and as some people know, there are actually the left-handed and also the right-handed.
Yeah.
One of those, of course, became known as the Nazi symbol, and the other one is still today commonly used in Buddhism, but of course the symbol goes back much further. So that's just one example of how kind of deep and rich this book is, which shouldn't surprise us because it's Alan Moore, and he does that. The
swastika is also described by Lovecraft as a symbol which can ward off the fish people.
Oh, okay, right. Yeah. So there was that little element I didn't get from my research on Wikipedia.
It kind of presages what's going to come in 25 years, right, with the Nazis.
Yeah.
It's interesting, like Alan Moore has kind of drawn that connection, because there is that undercurrent of, he is pulling on Lovecraft's racism as well.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
But
for sure, like
it's not just Lovecraft. Sorry, it's not just Nazi violence. In issue 11, we see the FBI rolling in and destroying the community.
Yes.
And that's explicitly tied to American miscegenation laws.
Yes.
And race hatred in America, effectively persecuted by state terrorism. And one of the aspects of Nazi Holocaust, Nazi genocide, is that they took a lot of lessons from America, and they were quite admiring of the race laws that the United States had. And a lot of what Providence is also about is this notion of the repressed within America, the things within America that are not said or not spoken. And in fact, Robert Black assumes he's going to write the great novel about this, because he's a gay man who's closeted, and he's also a Jewish man who hides his religion and his race, and he presents as a heteronormative Christian WASP. And his goal is to be inspired to write the great American novel, and he's considering calling it, at one point he considers the title Marblehead, an American Undertow, which I love, but it's this constant idea of what's beneath.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, he's wandered into a story where what's beneath is this horrific realm of monsters and creatures and dream demons and all this kind of stuff. But it's also what's beneath America. And what's really beneath America is hatred and violence. And as the series progresses, we see more and more and more of that, to the point where at the end, Meryl, the FBI agent who's become the mother of Cthulhu, more or less says, fuck the world. Like,
yeah.
You know, why defend this place? Like, why? It's clearly rotten. And there's this almost shift in your sympathies, particularly in issue 11, where all these monstrous figures of horror that we've been sort of seeing looming in the back of panels with Jacen Burrows' art, like this idea of these sort of fish people and then the invisible creature. And when we see them getting taken down, there's almost a pang of sympathy for them. Because
I think so completely. Yeah,
they're being taken down by an authoritarian society.
No, I completely agree with that. I think that earlier on in the book, there's the organization, the Stella Sapient, probably the incorrect pronunciation, but this secret society that is trying to bring about I guess they're not really into the Redeemer prophecy, but there's this Redeemer prophecy where the messenger is going to bring the message to yada, yada, yada. But it's the whole kind of rebirth of the world.
Please. Just to get the pun dead on.
Yeah.
It's the Herald. It's the Herald who works for the New York Herald.
Exactly. Yes. The Herald, and the messenger is black, and it's very, very punny. But just to finish my thought there, the point is that this is kind of the typical sinister secret society conspiracy to, quote unquote, bring about rebirth, but it's really, really dark and nasty. But yeah, absolutely, Emmet. When I got to book 11, book 12, the end of this, I'm like, no, this rebirth is like necessary. Like this. Okay, now we've got Azathoth and Cthulhu ruling the world, and it's good. Thank God.
But it's very similar to the ending of Promethea, which also is the end of the world. Mm-hmm. And then, the end of the world in Promethea is kind of the birth of ideas and creativity and imagination. And I feel like so this book was very, very upsetting for me. It's very frightening, and I was shaking at the end of both reads, and I'm looking forward to reading it a third time with dread. But I was very confused. Not confused is not the right. Deliberately about what the end of the world means, and is it a kind of fictional thing? I think there's even a line where, I don't know if I can find it, but the head FBI guy says around issue 12 that what's changing is maybe the world inside us, and maybe that's the only world that's changing, as if things are changing internally because of Lovecraft stories. Now, this is all very layered and confused. Again, I'll use that word, because from the get-go, it's 1919, but it's not our 1919. It's an alternate universe 1919 where they have these suicide chambers in Central Park where you can go in and listen to a record, and you'll be gassed to death, which is, again, a presage of what's going to come.
Can I jump in again? Sorry.
Yes, please do.
You know where that's from?
No, I know it's from something, but I didn't look it up. So tell us.
Robert W. Chambers, The Repairer of Reputations.
Okay.
So that's one of the stories collected in The King in Yellow.
Right.
Which is repeatedly referred to.
Right.
In Providence.
Yeah. Okay, so that's a fictional book, but it's also the world they live in. So
correct. We're
already like, okay, what's going on? And then we get these 12 issues of going through Lovecraft stories, and those stories, I believe, are out of copyright, but he never uses the actual names of characters. And I had a similar experience with Dana's experience with The Color Out of Space, because when they came to Hector North, I immediately recognized him as Herbert West, because I'd seen Stuart Gordon's Reanimator movie. And that's the only reason I knew. But as soon as I knew that one little nugget, every pun in there about, which was supposed to be kind of about homosexuality, like we love the bodies of young men, is not about homosexuality. It's about let's kill this guy and reanimate him.
Yeah.
And I only needed to know that much to kind of pick up on that much of it. But the point is, so then you get to, okay, so then the notebook of Robert's, which for the novel he's writing, ends up in Lovecraft reads it. Lovecraft ends up writing all these stories. He's changed the names that Robert has come up with, I guess. But then in the issue 11, we see all of the things that happen in the future to all those characters, like they get killed or stuff. And all that stuff is what happens in Lovecraft stories, but it's after he's written them. So like he's written the stories, and then what he's written comes true in the world of Providence. And then we get to the end, and we're not really sure if it's actually the world ending or if it's minds affected by fiction, and we're entering a new thought space, which is kind of the idea in Promethea.
Can I read out a bit from Mr. Lovecraft himself?
Okay.
Which I think addresses this.
Okay.
I believe this is from Call of Cthulhu. The more merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. Yes. We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. The science, each straining in its own direction, have hitherto harmed us little, but someday the piecing together of disassociated knowledge will open up such terrifying vistas of reality and of our frightful position therein that we shall either go mad from the revelation or flee from the deadly light into the peace and safety of a new dark age. And I feel that describes exactly what happens in issue 12.
Yeah.
Because reality is ripped open. This new dream reality reasserts itself. S.T. Joshi, the Lovecraft scholar, and the FBI agent Meryl Breers, I think her name is, are left standing on a bridge, and they talk about this very concept. They say
a real person and a fictional person.
Correct.
Yeah.
And they say, and the real person even comments on the fact that he's aware he's now in a Lovecraft fiction, and he thinks it's ironic. Like he knows he's a scientist of Lovecraft, he says, or he's described as. They know their choice is to either embrace this or go mad. And at the end of the story, they're still debating which option they're going to choose, which I think is such a dry and almost humorous version of the apocalypse. And I'm really happy you mentioned Promethea, because I think this is the dark twin to the usurpation of immateria in Promethea. Sure. This idea of, right, well, everything's fictional now. That doesn't mean the world is over. It means it's a new kind of reality, and not everyone's going to come along and accept it. And we're going to have to figure out how to live in this new reality. That's what an apocalypse is. It's when the old order gets torn down, and then this new version of reality asserts itself.
Yeah, I think that is, I think, an important distinction, that this is more of an apocalypse, a rebirth, if you really want to get positive about it. But yeah, I think to use the phrase "end of the world" is perhaps a little bit, kind of missing the, not the point. I don't want to sound overly critical of the phrase, but yeah, I think rebirth or apocalypse or. Yeah, it's appropriate given given the times we live in as well.
But another thing about the ending is, so Moore he asks a question in issue 12, which is like, he says, okay, so Lovecraft made up the Necronomicon, and then a lot of people later tried to write fake versions and say that it was real. And he says, who else in history has created a fiction which has penetrated reality as much? And they say, well, maybe the Bible. But he has he's deliberately gone out of his way to diss Dracula by Bram Stoker 3 times at least, or maybe even 4 through the course of 12 issues. And I think Dracula probably fits the bill as much as Lovecraft, if not more. I mean, my mom knows who Dracula is. She does not know what Cthulhu is, if you know what I mean. And he also says, he kind of goes out of his way to say, well, Dracula's kind of weak because they can just they can use some amulets or something and defeat him and not have to worry about him anymore. But I mean, they ram Cthulhu with a boat in Call of Cthulhu and then get away. You know what I mean? Like with a speedboat or a tugboat or something. So I think it's a little bit, he's kind of fudged the influence of Lovecraft maybe a bit, or maybe elevated him to Alan Moore's elevated him to his stature in his own eyes, if you know what I mean.
Well, I mean, sorry, Don.
Just let me say, has Alan Moore elevated Lovecraft, or has our culture of Lovecraft, I say we as in the society, the popularity of Lovecraft has been elevated? I don't think it's Moore that's doing it. I think it's already been done.
Exactly what I was going to say. I think within Moore's lifetime, he's seen Lovecraft fiction suddenly take off.
Yeah. And
in a big way being embraced by the larger culture and find its way into movies. And, you know, when you had a movie critic reviewing the Mouth of Madness, John Carpenter's The Mouth of Madness, describe in a review, that was 94?
Yeah, something like that.
Maybe say, oh, this is a Lovecraftian story. I imagine the majority of the audience reading that review would go, what? And if you were to do that now, if you were to say Annihilation is a Lovecraftian science fiction movie, I think there'd be a larger proportion of the audience who go, oh, I know exactly what you mean, because the culture has come along. And Alan Moore explicitly has that wonderful panel in issue 11 with the Yog Soth, the little fun pop Cthulhu beasties.
Yeah.
Like that to me is like, that's the pinnacle. There you go. It's pop culture now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I agree with that. I just think that to say it's the only thing that has penetrated the culture, like, and to mention Dracula 4 times in the same book and not draw that connection seems a bit, I don't know. Anyway.
Stoker fanboy.
Yeah, I'm not a Stoker fanboy. I'm just saying he pointed. You know, they use a magic spell to get rid of the beastie in the Dunwich Horror, which Moore has gone out of his way to say that kind of thing doesn't happen in Lovecraft. Well, it does happen. You can ram Cthulhu with a boat and cast a spell on this creature. Yeah. But anyway.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good point. It's definitely a good point. But there's also something definitely different about the way that Lovecraftian mythology has permeated the culture. I think that Dracula certainly spawned a genre, or like we've got vampires. Not that Bram Stoker invented them. I'm sure that it goes
certainly typified
before that. Yeah, but yeah, exactly. And there's no question that with Anne Rice and the Twilight Saga and Underworld, which I just recently watched. Yeah, there's no question. But the thing is that each of those works kind of create their own mythology.
Sure. Yeah.
Whereas the Necronomicon, it's like a thing that so many people think is real.
Yeah. Yeah.
And and even like The Evil Dead, which is not a Lovecraftian horror, although you could argue that it is, contains the Necronomicon. Like it's just it's more insidious or something. There's a difference.
Sorry, I just want to mention totally out of nowhere that a few weeks ago I watched a 90s cheeseball horror movie called Evil Toons. It's one of those kind of nudie horror movies from the 80s and 90s. And it turns out that all these buxom co-eds go to Miskatonic University. It's just one line in the middle of the movie. Okay, well, let's. So we've talked about the end of the book. I've actually got too many notes. I took so many notes on this thing that they're of no use to me whatsoever. I'm like scrolling through. It's literally 11 pages in a Word doc. So I didn't really know how we want to. What the best way to start talking about this thing and how frightening it is. And
well, can I quickly just try and segue from what we were previously talking about? I know you are actually already doing that. I apologize, but I think there's a bridge here to be made. So you mentioned Dracula, and you mentioned all these other authors, and there's two things here in terms of the proliferation of Lovecraft. One is that all these other works are constrained by ownership, authorship, copyright.
Yes. Yeah.
You know, Dracula is the work of Bram Stoker. If you use the characters from Dracula, you're adapting the work of Bram Stoker.
Right.
Lovecraft allowed his disciples to take his creations and do their own thing. You know, August Derleth, all those people. And issue 11 of Providence articulates how that went down. It shows all these collaborators who came in afterwards and popularized his characters. And I think that's a great illustration of why it spread, because he opened it up to everyone. The other thing, though, is that I think the source of horror and fright from Lovecraft is that with Dracula, you still have the notion of a status quo. You still have the notion of Christian mercy and salvation. And the society in which it's been published, there has to be a restoring of the status quo at the end of the story. So Mina will be tempted, but she'll ultimately come back. And you may be damned to be a vampire, but we can give you release. We can cut off your head and your soul will be released.
Yeah.
So this is notion of there is still salvation. In Lovecraft, even if you survive,
Yes.
you are completely warped. You will never be the same person. Status quo can never be reattained. And I think that's the source of a lot of the horror. And Lovecraft, this idea of losing your mind because you've glimpsed what is really real. And Providence is itself concerned with what is real, what is fiction.
Yeah.
From the very first issue, we're being asked to accept a version of events that we know is not true. So even the character of Lily, in the first issue, we see things from Lily's point of view. Each panel is from Lily's point of view. We assume it's a woman.
Yeah.
It's and sorry,
It's
not to be insensitive. Lily, for all intents and purposes, is a woman.
Yes.
Yeah.
Behaves as a woman, is addressed as Lily. But Lily then appears as a man and enters the suicide garden and kills themselves. And that is because the version of events that we saw in this story, where there was this great love affair, was destroyed because Robert Black can't be seen for who he really is. So a lot of this book is about perception. It's what is your reality? Who are you really?
I'm going to tell you something. I'm going to add to that. So around issue 2, so I'd kind of forgotten about the suicide gardens and it taking place in a fictional world. And I actually started to think, oh, wait, so is this how Lovecraft got his ideas? Is more writing a comic about the actual thing that became the Necronomicon? Like, I forgot that it was fiction. I started to think it was some kind of a nonfiction thing. And we haven't talked about, at the end of every issue, there's about 10 pages of this diary in prose. It's heavy reading. Each issue took me about 60 to 90 minutes to read, especially because of these diary things. And those are all told because it's a diary, it's in first person. So you become Robert Black for 20, 30 minutes when you're reading those pages. And I really I literally became kind of dizzy and was in this bizarre kind of hypnotic state around issues 2 and 3, and it was kind of a lot of it. And then by the end, even reading it the second time, as I said before, I was so confused about what was fiction and nonfiction, and everything is a fiction of something else taking place within this whole thing. So it was really, I'm just agreeing with everything you're saying about about perception and reality, for sure.
As much as I didn't necessarily agree with both of you saying you don't need to read Lovecraft, you don't need to read the previous Moore stories to understand exactly what's going on in Providence. I think you do. I would prefer, I'd never read Neonomicon. I've said that a couple of times in this podcast. I'll say it again. One of the things about Providence that annoys me is that now Neonomicon is canonical. Right. God damn it.
So we should mention that a little bit, especially not even just for the readers, but for the listeners, but for Dana as well, because Well, all we'll say is it's about the agent from the end of this series, and they investigate, and she gets raped by this Lovecraft monster, and then she ends up pregnant. And it turns out that the waters under which Cthulhu sleeps are actually the amniotic fluid. Basically, it's just 4 issues building up to this punchline. But I think the problem with it is it's a brutal horror comic. And Alan Moore said he wrote it because he got hit with a heavy tax bill. And he keeps saying this. He said this in 10 interviews. He said he got this tax bill and he needed to pay it, so he took the money to write this thing. And he was in a very dark place when he wrote it. And it's the most gruesome thing and miserable. But the thing is, it's basically empty calories. It's like The Killing Joke or some of the Image stuff he wrote, where it's just a bunch of stuff that happens. And once you've closed the book, it has no effect on your life or how you view the universe or anything, which is, I think, the opposite of Providence, because I think this is like Promethea. It really alters your perception of how you look at things when you come out of it.
And the events of issue 2 of Providence take place in the same location as Neonomicon. It's the same place that the cult has reestablished their foothold in. I was going to say, as much as I don't agree that you don't need to have a grounding in Lovecraft to understand Providence, blah, 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 as I said before, you absolutely need to read the Commonplace book. That's the sections at the end of each issue.
Yes.
Because
Yeah.
Robert's perception of himself and of other people, he's so conceited at the start of this. He's so arrogant and rude to poor Dix and Prissy and his colleagues at the Herald, and he misinterprets everything. But one of my favorite issues is Providence issue 7, which is the Pikmin parody, where you have apparently it's the one issue I own physically, because Moore commented that it's the most expensive comic he's ever made, because there's actual photographs in the comic that were staged to. They had to pay for the setting, they had to pay for the makeup on the
monster makeup
on the ghouls, they pay for the photographer, obviously. So it's actually very
those are photographs, really?
No, it's the last panel.
Picture.
The last panel.
We see what happens to Eamon O'Brien. Anyway, so I love that issue. I think it's a great issue. I think it really explores the original story, and it's one of my favorite Lovecraft stories. But the account by Black of his mental state that's in issue 7 is the most heartbreaking, because that's where you see he's on the cusp of realizing what's going on, and then he retreats from it.
Yeah, that's the one where like the first page is just like a line written, it's crossed out.
So we need to describe a bit of issue 6 before we get to that, because issue 6 is, you'd think it would be the most it's like the most brutal thing that happens, but basically he meets this 13-year-old girl. He thinks she's a 13-year-old girl. Actually, she has been mind swapped with this old man who keeps mind swapping for hundreds of years.
Etienne Roulet, who came across in the 17th century, I think.
Okay. So she lures him back to her house, he, and then she mind swaps with him. So the old man is now in Robert's body, and Robert's brain is now in the girl of this 13-year-old, in the brain of the 13-year-old girl, and then Robert's body rapes the girl.
Yeah.
Now, I've thought about this so many times because I keep getting confused about it. It's like, oh, Robert's raping himself. No, he's not. It's his body, but his brain, and it's the girl. No, it's not the girl. It's Robert's brain, or it's the old man. And it just got super confused. But anyway, he is, of course, he's mortified by this in the next. And that's when we get to the diary. And also, I want to say, before we get to that little bit, the great thing about the diaries too is sometimes they are foreshadowing, and sometimes they're ironic, because we know what has happened, and he's like, oh, maybe I was in a state of hypnosis or something like this. But especially so in this issue, he reads the analog of the Necronomicon, the Book of the Wisdom of the Stars in Providence.
It's the Katib here, isn't it?
Yes, the Kitab al-Hikmah al-Najmiyah. Yep. So he reads it and he has this, whoa, he had the same experience I had reading Providence. He's like, he's kind of dizzy and he's all messed up and he's like, okay. And then he goes out in the street and he's all disoriented and he's like, wait a second, I've only been here a day. And he learns that he's been there for a few weeks and he's like, what is going on? The girl lures him back to her house. The incident happens. Then we get the diary entry, which is about all the stuff that happens before that. And the last line is, he's writing while he's in the library reading the book, and he's like, oh, it's gotten dark outside. I better get out of here before it's too late. It's too late. It's such a perfect line. Because in the comic, he has crossed that line, the line of no return. He's in too deep, and he's read the book, and there's no getting out. And that line has nothing to do with the library. It's about him being in the underworld at this stage. Anyway, please say what you were going to say about the diary in 7, where it's crossed out at the beginning several times.
Well, just that idea of him completely losing his sense of time, completely losing his sense of self, and that I was just looking up. I read a review of Providence on the Comics Journal, and I'm just looking up the name of the writer so I can. Craig Fisher wrote it. It's a good accounting of the first 6 issues of Providence. So he gets to this issue and the experience of Robert being raped and victimized by Etienne Roulet's personage. I don't know how else to put it. It's entity Etienne Roulet, and Elspeth Wade is the current host. Anyway, Fisher writes this review, and he gets to this sequence, and he describes it, and he gives his account, and he questions Moore's use of rape, and I think that's a very important conversation to have too.
Yeah.
But he gets to this point, and he says, well, clearly, now that Black knows what's happening, he's going to change his actions, because clearly now it's all been revealed to him, and now he understands what the kind of story he's in.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. There was a very similar after issue 6 on Comic Books Are Burning in Hell podcast where they were like, okay, now things are just getting worse and worse and worse. But actually, there's kind of a recovery because he convinces himself that he was hypnotized or in a dream state when that happened, and then things go back to the normal state of weirdness.
Well, there's something brilliant about how, and again, this is why it's my favorite issue. Issue 7 opens with riots in Boston.
Yeah.
And the riots are caused by the Coolidge, who is, I think he's the governor.
Yeah.
And he's basically been starving the police force and the police union movement of funds and causing them to become vilified because they've gone on strike, and then chaos has descended, and now he's saying, oh, well, they're Bolsheviks, I'm going to shut them down. So we open with this scene of total carnage and soldiers shooting people in the face and kids throwing bricks. And I'm reading this, and then I'm reading what's going on in Portland at the moment, and there was this sort of, again, Alan Moore, goddamn you, you're a witch. The synchronicities that happen whenever I read Alan Moore and I look at what's going on around me. It's always very disturbing to me. So Black is thrown off a bus into the middle of a riot.
Yeah.
He's completely confused. The world is confused.
Yeah.
The veil of repression over America has lifted briefly, just as his own sense of self has been completely annihilated. And in that state, he meets an Irish cop who's trying to get pissed. Aaron O'Brien, who takes pity on him and tries to help him get to where he needs to go, and then he suffers his fate as well, because goodness in this universe will be punished. Nothing good will ever go unpunished. But what's interesting about what happens to Black next is the artist feels sorry for him because he knows Black is a vessel for what's coming. He knows he's an instrument. And he says, well, I think you should at least learn why you're doing what you're doing. You should at least have all the facts.
Yeah,
of course, he can't do that. He can't apprehend the nature of what's happening to him. He immediately rationalizes it. Immediately.
Yeah. So every time there's this beautiful back and forth where the artist, the photographer and painter that Black tracks down, like tells him you're a vessel, da 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 da, and Black kind of like, oh, so you mean like I was, hallucinating, or he interprets it in the most mundane way possible, and the artist is just like, every time the artist is just like, yeah, I guess you could say it that way, like, and it's like repeated. Yeah,
there's a whole diary entry, I can't remember what issue it was in, where he says, well, what would happen if a person actually encountered something supernatural? And he says, well, they would try to explain it off. And he often describes exactly what's happening to him or is going to happen to him, and writes it off as, oh, they would probably think this and that. And
and that's what he does.
Yeah. And sometimes so sometimes a diary is like we have dramatic irony from them because we know what's actually going on, or at least we think we do. I'm still questioning some of it at the end.
The cruelest irony of all is that Black has taken a leave from his job at the Herald because he wants to be an author. He wants to write this book. And these sections that we're reading are not just his diary. We also see him attempting story ideas.
Yes.
Yeah. And sometimes he will actually try and rationalize away what's happened to him and try and make it fiction. So he's trying to make it safe, make it a story. But he never pursues it. He never is able to finish a story.
Yeah.
And the horrible irony is he will give this book to Lovecraft. Lovecraft can finish the story. Black could never be the writer he wanted to be.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, he can just witness these things. He's not a writer. He doesn't have the talent. Lovecraft does. Lovecraft is able to take all this stuff and make something out of it. And that's why Black is the Herald and Lovecraft is the Redeemer.
Well, that's interesting too, for a couple of reasons. But one is that those diary entries, I mean, the fragments of stories or novels, I mean, one of them in issue 7 is he comes up with this thing where somebody can swap minds and like violate other people, and they've been doing it for hundreds of years. He figures out, he actually describes exactly what happened to him without realizing it. But I think even Alan Moore himself says at the end, that Lovecraft was very ordinary in issue 12, and that the writing, I mean, if you've read Lovecraft, and I read these stories, I read 400 or 500 pages of the stuff that I got for Christmas, and I'd read them in the 90s, but it was like hard work. I mean, the prose is so circuitous, and there's double or triple negatives. He's so distant from the horror and the action a lot of times. And Dunwich Horror, which was one of my favorites 25 years ago, I reread now, and it's like, it's described like it's being written by a reporter. It's just a list of facts, and then this guy went here and that went there, and it's not really, it's so far from it. It's the opposite of Providence, where you're deep into it. There are very few scenes in Providence that Robert Black is not in. I can only even think of like 1 or 2 off the top of my head before issues 11 and 12. So I don't even think Lovecraft was a better writer necessarily than Black. I think he was the Redeemer. Somehow there was something about his approach to the fiction maybe that...
Well, I mean, Lovecraft wrote an essay about being an amateur writer.
Yeah.
And this idea of writing as something to occupy yourself, writing as something that you are doing, not expecting to make a career out of it. And I remember being really inspired by that when I was in my 20s when I read that essay, because I was going, look, at the end of the day, no one's going to be another Stephen King. Stephen King's got that job. Right. Your job is to write for pleasure, write for your peers, write for the few people who enjoy what you're doing. And then if you get better, great. There's something quite sort of placid about that. But here's the thing about Lovecraft. He finished the stories.
Yes.
He finished the stories. So he's admittedly a hack. And I did an episode of Deconstructing Comics where we talked about Dennis O'Neill and with Jonathan W. Gray, and I mentioned, he's a cheerful hack.
Yeah.
And I don't mean that as an insult.
Yeah.
I think it's very important to be a hack. You need to write for the sake of writing. You need to just get it done.
Yeah.
Just finish the thing. And Black is conceited because Black thinks he's... And part of this story is knocking him down again and again and again, to the point where his reward with Johnny Carcosa is an additional humiliation. It's like, this is what you deserve. This is all you deserve. You don't deserve to be a writer. You don't deserve to be even a good writer. You are just a guy getting a sexual act in a hotel room. That's all you are. And it's a horrible scene for Black because he realizes that's all I am. I am just this animal this animal desires manifest.
And he's crying. He's crying. He's being raped again.
Because he's got his ambition has led him to this. Yeah. That's it. And Lovecraft will actually write the stories.
Yeah.
And they're not necessarily good. Not saying that.
Yeah. No. Yeah. And I think actually Providence is, in a sense, in some ways, the opposite of Lovecraft. So, for example, I loved the voices and all the voices of the characters in Providence. And Alan Moore often writes characters with phonetics. He writes a dialogue with kind of phonetic voices, and he doesn't do that in this book. Like, they meet Laura Dunsany, and Robert
comments
Black,
on the fact that he's got a brogue, but you don't actually see the brogue.
He says, I love his Irish accent or whatever, but Moore doesn't write it out that way. Now, that's the opposite of Lovecraft. Lovecraft, there was no dialogue in those stories. People never talk to each other. It's just you get blocks of text, blocks of description. When somebody talks, you get paragraphs of description. And every time you run into a hillbilly, you'll get paragraphs of hillbilly, like phonetically written out, I reckon this, that, that kind of thing, for pages and pages. And Moore does the opposite, completely the opposite of that. And I love, and kind of related to that, I love that, Robert Black is a character that Lovecraft would have hated because he's a homosexual Jew. And that kind of comes up around issue 8 or 9, somewhere in there, where Lovecraft's prejudices come out. Yeah.
He breaks Black's heart because he's talking about his friend Loveman, and he's just so contemptuous towards him.
Yeah,
this is his friend.
Yeah,
and Robert Black is like, "Oh, you're exactly what I was afraid you'd be."
Yeah.
Coming up, Jacen Burrows' art, the disadvantages of reading Providence in Comixology's guided view, separating Lovecraft's uncomfortable prejudices from his work, and more. Support us on Patreon. You'll help cover expenses of making the show and move us toward unlocking the earliest episodes of Deconstructing Comics and a new podcast series about the manga Full Metal Alchemist. You'll also be supporting our To the Bat Poles podcast. Just go to patreon.com/deconcomics and make your monthly pledge. If you pledge at least $4 a month, you'll get access to all of our bonus podcasts, reviewing the first year of Amazing Spider-Man and all of the MCU and Spider-Man films. And coming soon, a review of the Amazon Prime show, The Boys. It's all at patreon.com/deconcomics. We thank you for your support.
You like cheap comic books, right? Well, I'm Professor Allen, and I talk about cheap comic books on the Quarterbin podcast. In every episode, I'll dissect a single comic from my collection, as long as I paid no more than 25 cents for the issue. Forget about $4 new comics that you can read in 4 minutes, or crossover events that can cost $100 to collect. Join me in the Quarterbin, where even bad comics are a bargain, and good ones are a steal. The Quarterbin podcast is part of the Relatively Geeky Podcast Network. Visit us at relativelygeekypodcast.blogspot.com or search Relatively Geeky or Quarterbin Podcast in iTunes. I guarantee it'll be worth every penny.
Can we talk about Jacen Burrows?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. I've seen some, I think, very unfair comments about Burrows' work in this.
Okay.
I think he is the perfect collaborator for Moore's Lovecraft
100%
writing, because I think, as I said before, a lot of Providence is about what's on the surface, what's beneath the surface. And Burrows has a particular quality in how he does faces, where there's a certain flatness. And I think that works beautifully here. And I think it's all about what's this unsettling flatness there's something disturbing about the faces.
Yeah.
And I think he's perfect for the material. And I also think he's come along in leaps and bounds as an artist. I think seeing him from the courtyard to this, he's grown so much, and Cross as well, and all the other stuff he's done for Avatar. I think this is one of the best pieces of work Jacen Burrows has ever done. I think the architectural sense of Providence, of New England, the streets, the buildings, I think it's beautifully rendered. And I love the covers where there's no people.
Yeah.
I love that there's these depopulated New England that Jacen Burrows has fashioned. And there's something so characterful, even though there's no people there.
Yeah. Absolutely, 100%.
Yeah, everything's looming on every cover. I mean, even there's one or two, the perspective is we're kind of looking down on the building, but it's still sort of, everything has this looming kind of menace to it.
Yeah. In issue 1, when after Lily kills himself, Robert's face is, you don't get much emotion from it. Like, he's hiding his emotions, obviously, but it's the exact stiffness you're talking about, but that suicide is what sends Robert on this journey through New England to get away and, center himself and write this book. But it's kind of about Lily's death. But it was really interesting to me that he seems cold, and I think he's described as cold by someone. Emotionally cold as well.
Lily says he's cold.
Yes, Lily says he's cold
because it's the and of course the cutting back and forth in Burrows' art between what's happening to Black and then what's happening to the doctor he's just visited, and Cold Air, the story Cold Air. So you have that idea of coldness, but the doctor is passionate and full of love with the woman in his house, whereas Black refuses love out of fear of being seen for who he really is.
Yes.
And it's so sad in issue 12 when he meets Dix again, and he finally says, "I'm queer."
Yeah.
And his colleague's like, "Oh yeah, okay, whatever. Well, sometimes I'd turn."
Yeah. Sometimes if there's no girls around on a Friday night, some of me and the guys. Yeah.
It's like, it doesn't even matter to me, man.
Yeah. Very. Yeah. Yeah,
maybe not representative of the typical response in the 1920s, but
well, I mean, I question that because I think, all right, like Lovecraft was famously much more bigoted than even people in his own time were. This is some, like, people tend to try and excuse his bigotry, saying, "Oh, he was a man of his time." Said, no, he was noted for being worse. Like, he actually was pathological in his hatred of Jews, of homosexuals, of particularly people of African descent. He was,
I think hillbillies especially.
Yeah, anyone
for some reason, hillbillies and rednecks.
And the Europeans from below the Austrian line, like, he seems to really hate.
Yeah.
But so, I want to say, can I just say, interject one thing here? Please remember your point, because I want you to come back to it. But it's funny, I've owned a few Lovecraft collections in my time, including this one. It's interesting because they tend to leave out the worst stories. Or let's say the obvious stories. Now, sometimes I hear people say that the stories about beings coming from outer space and procreating with humans is some fear of other races, but I don't really buy that, because it's usually having hillbillies, and sometimes it's rich people. It's rich white people who are, with these spell books or whatever. But I mean, it's totally there in the works, which they tend to not reprint. So I think sometimes you can read these, except for Rats in the Walls, which has a cat with a name that I won't repeat. Let's just say it starts with N. It's almost an interesting thing about horror is sometimes it doesn't know what it's about. So if you look at like Invasion of the Body Snatchers and communism, they didn't know. If you asked anybody on the crew, they're like, no, there was no metaphor there. Or Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and everybody's like, well, this is about the Vietnam War. And they're like, no, we weren't thinking about that. But sometimes horror is about more than what it itself is. I think that's the way a lot of these stories work. So I think that his bigotry doesn't really come out. It comes out in the stories that are not printed as much anymore. But I do think it's interesting that they were printed and they have been reprinted, and nobody's really called them over the years. So I think he was more bigoted than people of his time, but I don't think he was outside the parameters, let's say.
Sure. No, clearly he understood what he could get away with.
Yes.
I think, though, the point is he was so persistent in it. I think we've drawn this comparison before in this show where we talked about Preacher, and I mentioned one of my favorite scenes of Preacher is Odin coming to the KKK meeting, and there's two robed up members of the KKK, and they're saying, "Oh, Odin's coming. Oh God, I just can't stand him." Like, why? What's wrong with him? He says, "Well, look, he just keeps talking about how much he hates black people." I mean, I hate them too, but I had a really good conversation with Billy Bob the other day about tractors. Like this notion of just not shutting up about it. And again, that the point of the joke is racism doesn't make sense. Like expecting it to make any logical sense is you're wasting your time. That's what racism is. It doesn't make sense. It's pathological. Yeah. And Lovecraft was that way to the nth degree. And what I was getting to before was that how we see sexuality and how we think of sexuality and race relations and the idea of how a person who is not white, Anglo-Saxon, heteronormative could live in those days is strongly influenced by the media we've taken in, and the versions of media we've taken in are presenting a point of view, and we shouldn't automatically trust that point of view. To suggest that people weren't engaging in sexual acts with members of whatever gender, and that only happened 20 years ago or something, is something that some people today firmly believe. They think that all of a sudden people have started exploring gender and sexuality in new, different, strange ways. That is not true. It's always been there. There's this notion that all of a sudden race has become an issue. That is not true. It was always there. There was always people who were saying, no, this is wrong.
I do love that Robert, I love the number of people he has sex with. Like he meets so many gay people. Every issue almost he's found, runs into someone. It's like, oh, here's a hot guy and we're going to get it on, or I hope we do, or something like that. Yeah.
That's why you need to read the diary extracts, because you're getting some internal monologue because the comic doesn't have it. Yeah. And again, going back to Jacen Burrows' art and this notion of surfaces, that's what's so important. This is the version of the self that he wants to present. And it is the version that he really is, that he commits, and it's still coded. He still doesn't come out and say, I had sex with the receptionist in Athol. He says, we had a good time.
Well, I was going to say, like, it's really not, it's not quite as clear cut, like which is the surface and which is the real. Like, I think that they kind of trade off that role at different times. Like, actually, I think your comment that it's coded, like in the Commonplace book, the diary, he's even in that writing. The way I interpret it is that he knows if anyone picks this up and reads it, and he's just blatantly writing about, I met this hot guy and we banged in the hotel, like, he can't write that. So he has to refer to the guy as, I met this person, the charming receptionist or whatever, So it's kind of coded or veiled, however thinly.
But I love that Lovecraft read it and was too thick to realize what was going on.
Yeah. Oh, it gets better. It's when the feds read it in the, I think the 50s, and they're going, I think he might be queer. Yeah.
No, he doesn't say that. Doesn't he say, I think he might be a commie?
He also alludes to his sexuality.
Yeah.
Also does he? Okay, okay. Yeah, but anyway,
I think he thinks he's a commie because he's a queer.
That's it.
Probably it.
Yeah.
That's it. Because that was... The belief was that, and again, this is a pathological regime within the FBI. This was if somebody's gay, that means they can be manipulated by the Soviets because gayness is a weakness and they'll be exploited.
Yeah,
that's
right.
Can we?
Which is insane, but that's where they were coming from.
Yep.
Sorry, to get back to Jacen Burrows for a second, can we talk about the wallpaper?
Tell me about the wallpaper, because I saw a reference to that and I didn't quite follow.
There was an interview with him. Somebody, I don't know, I didn't read it. I just noticed that they mentioned the wallpaper, but I don't know. Is it the same wallpaper this is a dumb question, in Lovecraft's room as in the room that the FBI agents are in issue 12? Like, I just don't know if Burrows would have gone for two different wallpapers, but he's used some sort of digital effect to put wallpaper on in the rugs. And there's another thing. So this is something I picked up on Facts Providence. I didn't notice it myself, but anytime you're in the quote unquote real world, the panel borders are hand drawn, so they're a little bit shaky. Anytime you're in the quote unquote dream world, the panel borders have been ruled, so they're straight. So when you get to issue 12, like almost the whole issue from about page 7 on, it's all straight.
Right.
Which is another bit of kookiness in there. And how about the colors? Should we talk about the Azathoth panel, the 2-page spread in issue 12,
Oh, wow.
that craziness? Because again, it kind of goes back to what you're saying, Emmett, about the almost stiffness of the art, which it needs to be. It needs to be stiff for the release at the end, for that Azathoth panel, which is crazy.
Dana, you were saying you just watched Color Out of Space, which is Stanley's Color Out of Space. What did you think of the little, I don't know if you picked up on issue 12, there's these little hints of purple light coming through as well, this ultraviolet light.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's so much there. Yeah, I'm just flipping through this stuff. Yeah, like I haven't read any criticism of the art. I think it was just, it was perfectly. I don't know. I'm not an artist. I can't comment beyond what you guys already have. I think that there was a flatness to faces, but there were also like subtle little reactions and stuff sometimes. Like when Lovecraft first starts, he's talking about his friend Loveman, and he's like, he's a degenerate. Like Robert's face just falls.
Yeah.
But like getting back to those colors, that's just.
So tell me again, how did they handle the colors in the movie? And there was a black and white one in the 90s or something too, right?
I have no idea how they did it, but it was basically just very
purple,
pinky purple, like very, very bright.
Mm-hmm.
But it wasn't. And then again, it wasn't just one value or one brightness. It was varying. But it was definitely pinky, purpley kind of thing, which I think does kind of connect in with what was the issue here in Providence, where Robert meets, is it Ansley in book 9? The guy he's got the glasses that allow him to see these ultraviolet spectra of light. And
you mentioned if we're going to just touch on companion films to this comic series, and I think knowing Lovecraft movies actually is a help, because I think Moore is referencing them multiple times. But that issue is a nod to Stuart Gordon's other Lovecraft film, From Beyond.
Okay.
Where he sees all the creatures in the purple ultraviolet light.
Huh.
And From Beyond also gets very sexual, because Stuart Gordon was a delightful perv. And
the Condolingus scene in Reanimator is one of the greatest scenes in cinema.
And then we see North's decapitated head later on. There's this implication that's what's coming. But in that issue with Ainsley and the descendant of Culver, is it? And they have sex in the tower. Again, there's that notion that the creatures that Ainsley can see are excited by desire. And orgone and all the rest of it. Like they
blue energy or whatever.
Yeah.
I love how he says that Henry Ainsley says, "Well, I see you guys are hitting it off."
Yes.
And it's from his point of view, and there's this like alien eel ghost snake like connecting the Robert Black and the young fellow's crotch.
Yes.
It's delightfully direct.
Again, because Burrows has created this visual style where everything's really stiff. When we throw in giant purple snake creatures floating in the ether,
or even as Dana said, a tiny facial movement. Any movement is there. It's
exaggerated.
Yeah.
I think it's just. I came to this when I first read Providence, but I think more him working on these Lovecraft books is just so perfect because Lovecraft himself is all style, artifice, really over-constructed writing.
Yeah.
People love it or hate it, but like it's there. There's so much going on the page when you read Lovecraft, and I feel like it's the art here is a way of sort of almost like a surface on top of all of that, and it's repressing that fervid energy of like Lovecraft's imagination, and it's this sort of pushing down, and then, as you said, issue 12, boom, we've got the Rippins in reality with Azazoth, and it all sort of builds to this. And I think part of that is this suspension of tension that's come throughout the entire series, all this repressed energy, and then just it comes out. So I really think it was a wonderful collaboration between the two of them. I think Burrows does a lot of really hard work, and I really want to spend some time on that. Is there a lot of artists, when they tackle Lovecraft, they're in a hurry. I think there's a vulgar approach to Lovecraft.
Yeah.
Let's show the thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, we've talked about this. It kind of goes back to what we were saying before about the permeation of Lovecraft in the culture. I feel like the last 10 horror comics we've talked about on this podcast, we've had to mention H.P. Lovecraft for one reason or another, including Uzumaki and the actual Lovecraft adaptation we did, Mountains of Madness. And like every other one. But sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, like, when we see Cthulhu in issue 12, we don't see Cthulhu.
We see Cthulhu. I love it. Cthulhu.
It's the segmented page.
Yeah.
How many panels is this? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 panel horizontal split page.
Yeah.
And it's just beat. I love it.
Yeah.
I think it's such a good approach. And again, because of Burrows and how he approaches the page and how he sort of keeps delaying.
Yeah.
There's this beautiful energy here.
Did you also notice how anytime they went underground in the series, the panels switched to vertical? 3 panels?
Yes.
God.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was cool.
Well, I bought this on Kindle, of Amazon Digital, and my iPad was not. It's the 10-inch or whatever, so it wasn't really comfortable reading it. Just one page per screen. Like the type is just a little bit too small. So the first time I read it, I held my device in landscape orientation and used the guided view, which would come from the Comixology originally, which now, of course, integrated into the Amazon Kindle app. But it was fine. There were a couple things. There were a couple of points where the adaptation, the guided view, skipped over things, but like maybe 1 or 2 what I would consider to be mistakes out of all the 12 issues, at least that I picked up on. When I reread the book, I just, because I had read it and I didn't need to focus too much on the actual text, I just did the full page, and it's incomparable. It's just so much better. I guess I've never really read anything in guided view before, so I was satisfied with the experience. But yeah, like there's so much going on, and I'm sure a lot of that was coming from Moore as well. I think, who knows? I think he's a wonderfully collaborative writer from what I've heard. So I think you got to give credit to Burrows for sure.
I'm going to send you folks if I can, a page from issue 12 again, because Kumar, you're mentioned there of whenever they go into the dream space,
Yeah.
and the panel borders in issue 12 when they're driving around the dome.
Yeah.
It goes vertical.
Yes.
Because
They're
now in a dream space.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which I think is a lovely touch. I had the same experience, Dana, with the guided view. I read these first on Comixology, and the issue 2 has Black discover the weird dock beneath Sidam's house.
Yeah.
And I missed that there were children's bones because for some reason, because it favored the guided view favors any piece of the image with dialogue.
Yeah.
So it cropped out that bit of the panel, so I didn't see what Black was seeing that caused him to go, oh no, but then Lilith appeared.
I might have even.
Yeah, I did. I don't think I even recognized it the second time I went through, but I'm looking at it now. Is it page 19 or something, just after he sees the golden pillar?
Yeah.
And then the third panel, the vertical panel, he's like, oh.
But how do you know that those are the bones of children? In fact, this was when he got to issue 10. Yeah. He writes in his diary, I think that something in the house might have something to do with the children. I was like, how did he know that?
Yeah, he's seen the bones. He's seen how small they are.
Oh, okay.
And then he actually heard the conversation between Gerritsen and Sidam, where they're talking about unripened fruit.
Yes.
And again, like his unconscious mind has finally put together what their code meant.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
That they're child traffickers. They were to these Lilith creatures. Actually, issue 2 is my least favorite in terms of. I feel as if there wasn't as much bang for my buck in issue 2 as there was in the other. But then issue 2 has Sidam's accounting of the Stella Sapiente and the history of the cult.
Yeah.
Which is him asserting, I don't think he has the inner track fully. I think he's making some guesswork sometimes, or maybe he's trying to confuse the record a bit. Because there's some things he says which we know aren't true. But that's quite rewarding. Reading all that's quite rewarding.
Yeah, I'm going to say also I loved issue 3, the diary, because we get an excerpt from the church newsletter. And it's full of super cheesy fish puns.
Yeah.
Non-stop cheesy, like 5-year-old fish puns. And I was like, what is going on? And then I read the Lovecraft story, and the hotel proprietor is literally named Gilman. His name is Gilman in the fish town. And I was like, he knows. He really knows. Like, this is a cheesy Lovecraft story. I'm going to fill this thing with Lovecraft cheese. And it's amazing, and I love it. It was so funny both times through. But the first time I was like, whoa, what is going on? And then especially after reading the Gilman thing, I was like, of course. And in the Lovecraft story, it's like, how can this guy not tell that these are fish people? It's so obvious. Every person he looks at, every single thing, it's like, these are fish people, dude. It's a real horror movie, like Get Out of the House, The Killer's in the House kind of thing. Except this time it's like
seals. There were a bunch of seals.
Yeah, it's so the goofiest Lovecraft story, even though it's one of the most famous ones.
Yeah.
It's so goofy, and I loved how goofy he made the situation. It's actually one of the only genuinely funny bits that was not like a deep, like a dark black laugh. It was like genuinely funny because it recognized what the bones of the original story, I think.
But isn't that great bit later on where Black is talking to Lovecraft, and Lovecraft is saying, "Oh, your book is wonderful. It's inspired me so much to think of Providence as this fantastical place." And Black says, "Are you joking?" He says, "No, I never do that. People get upset with me."
Yeah, that's a good line.
His sense of humor is terrible.
I do. Let's talk about Lovecraft too, because we do end up meeting Lovecraft in it, and I loved what a weirdo he was. He's such a
freak.
He's such a strange. He's like that guy, that weird guy in grade 11 or grade 10 that was like, what is with this guy? He was like the Jeffrey Dahmer of the group. who's just his behavior is totally kooky and like I don't understand anything. But he refers to himself as a grandfather. He refers to his aunt as his granddaughter. Everything he says is so strange, and I love that depiction of him as such an oddball, for sure.
Yeah, I think he's oddly. I almost want to say there's something weirdly charismatic about him, but I don't know if that's quite it. There's definitely something attractive about him, or magnetic.
Yeah.
And I think that's really, really effective. Or actually, what I want to say is the other way around, is that makes the reveal in issue 10 when he starts going on about the Jews and the homosexual deviants or degenerates, I think is the word that he uses. And he's kind of praising Loveman for not indulging in his animal deviant, whatever. So like, again, we're really effectively put in Black's shoes by being attracted to this guy,
yes,
and almost worshipful, and then we the readers are crushed as well when he reveals himself to be an unconscionable bigot.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's quite a. I think it's quite an effective portrayal, and I think it cannot be ignored that it's an undeniable criticism of the man.
Yeah.
I think Emmet mentioned before that, or somebody made reference before to the Lovecraft Society or whatever, saying that they were celebrating the works and not the. Yeah, I'm sorry, Kumar. I didn't want to give credit where credit wasn't due.
Okay. The Randolph, another thing I want to mention very briefly is a little tiny point, is the Randolph Carter idea about imagining yourself going down 700 steps to enter a state of lucid dreaming. I have tried that. It doesn't work. I've tried it when I go to bed. So I go to bed and I'm like, okay, I'm going to get myself to sleep. And I start counting and imagining myself going down steps. And I can get about up to 150, and then I get distracted or I lose count and I have to go back to 1 again. And I've never made it past about 140, 150. But that's another way that this book was like, it's sort of permeated my life when I was not reading it. I was thinking about it all the time. And also, to spoil the last panel, I teared up both reads of it when they tear up the book and throw it into the river in the same way that Lily tore up the love letter in the opening panels. And it just, after everything that he went through, and after I read it the first time, I thought these 2 issues at the end are I felt like they were a cheat going back to Courtyard and Neonomicon, and I felt like the book should have ended with Black's suicide.
Honestly, when I first read the series, I thought that was the last issue.
Right.
Because it delivers that idea of Lovecraft's apocalypse has unfolded because the popular culture has proliferated so much of his writing.
Yeah.
And I thought, perfect, that's the ending. Great. Then as, oh wait, no, we've got more apocalypse to go.
Right, more apocalypse, but especially that scene with after everything he went through, that book being torn into shreds at the end was so heartbreaking and upsetting to me.
And again, just to highlight how important it is to read the diary extracts, he sees that happening.
Yes.
Black has a vision of that happening.
Yes. He pictures the whole thing on the bridge. Yeah.
And he meets Briars and everything. And and she more or less accuses him of leading to her state of affairs, her becoming impregnated by the Deep Ones and everything. And he's going, I've no idea who you are.
Yeah.
He did, in effect.
There's a line too in that diary entry about he thinks they're throwing wedding confetti off the bridge, which is whoa. And then in the dream, he's been lured to the bridge under a false claim of paternity. He says, because we stayed at the same hotel with the same view out the window, and they did end up staying at the same hotel with the same thing out of the window. If you've read Neonomicon, that's actually a true thing that has come to him in this dream.
Yeah, none of this stuff at the end makes sense if you haven't read that earlier stuff.
Yeah, I don't know, but at least read in the diary. You've got to read all the stuff in the diary because so many lines are charged with double meanings in the dialogue and especially in the diaries, and it really is about, as Emmet said, perception. Okay, I think, like I said, I have 12 pages of notes. I don't think I think it kind of covered most of it. I'm going to say that I think this is really. Oh, we have to talk about, since we were talking about Comixology. This book it's the only way to read it is on Comixology, basically, because Avatar have got their heads up their asses. I feel like they're very close to being bankrupt because they're.
Okay.
If you're can you imagine sitting on a 12-issue career landmark series from Alan Moore and not putting out a 12-issue trade paperback? Well, they haven't done it.
Do a Kickstarter.
So they did a Kickstarter. No, for three hardcovers, 4 issues each, and that's what I ended up buying on eBay. I broke down. This is why this episode has taken 5 years to put together.
Wow.
Because
eBay.
I was waiting for a trade paperback of 12 issues, and it looks like that's never going to happen. I went on eBay and bought these 3 hardcovers, and they were putting out the hardcovers while the issues were coming out. This is another crazy thing. So like issue 5 or 6 came out, the hardcover for the first 4 comes out. It's like, and now there's been no word, no hint that this is coming out. And what I wanted to say, what my final word was, I think this is way up there with From Hell, Promethea, V for Vendetta, Watchmen, Providence, up there, top 2 or 3 easily. I think it's massive, affecting, upsetting. I think it's nearly perfect. I think maybe he didn't stick the landing, but that's true of probably 10 other Alan Moore series as well. And I would defend all of those as well. I will defend the however messy the ending might be, if it is messy.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, if ST Joshi gets stranded in a Lovecraftian apocalyptic nightmare, I'm pretty happy about that because I cannot stand the man. Sorry, Dana.
No, I was just going to say it certainly is a complex and layered work, and I think that this as far from mainstream sort of comics as you can get, not in the sense that it's bizarre or experimental, but it's so dense. I mean, we've alluded to, or we've not alluded to. Sorry, we've talked about. Just touched on the idea, like, you know, do you need to read Lovecraft going into this? Do you need to watch the movies? I mean, I don't think I'll kind of stand by the position that you don't need to have read a lot of Lovecraft going into this necessarily, but you certainly, you cannot possibly begin to appreciate all the layers that are here without having, and you know, this is what Emmet, you've said a few times, like, yes, absolutely, you have to come to this with a knowledge. Well, you don't have to come to it, I don't think, but you do have to at some point come back to it, at least having looked at the Lovecraft stuff. I mean, I'm kind of like you, Kumar, in that I have read a lot in probably the 90s and the early 2000s, so I wasn't completely ignorant, but none of it was really fresh in my mind. So I was able to get a simulation of that almost ignorant experience of it, which I think has its appeal. But it's such a complex and layered work, and when you figure in the diary entries and the comics aspect of it, the art and the writing, and then all of these ideas that Moore has talked about over his career of spelling literature as magic, layers of reality, etc., etc., etc. Like, yeah, I mean, is it top 1, top 2, top 3? I don't even know if I can comment, but in terms of having a lot of stuff to dig into and explore and work at as a reader, you're not going to get off easy for this one, but man, you're going to be rewarded when you start digging.
The word I keep thinking of is synthesis, because for me this is a great collaboration between Jacen Burrows and Alan Moore in terms of how they work together, how they've realized this vision of a Lovecraftian world and Lovecraftian universe. I also think Moore himself has synthesized all of Lovecraft's writing as well as the culture's response to Lovecraft, and delivered Providence, which takes this overview and then just dives in. So you come away from the experience of Providence going, all right, I now have a critical appreciation of Lovecraft, as well as a sense of exactly what he did and what he was writing about. And it's not hagiographic. It's not showing Lovecraft as this great dream weaver, Imagineer, Imaginaut, whatever. Like
it's not worshipful at all.
He was a hateful, bigoted, small-minded man
who was a visionary.
Was able to visualize these things, and it's almost like he was a hierophant for the hatreds of America in his fiction. And I think that's why I keep coming back to this idea that this is also about America. This is also about the repression of America's sense of self and its sense of its own history. And that's why Moore throwing in these references to Coolidge, to the FBI, to all these events over the history of this fictional 20th century have a lot of bearing on our real 20th century. There is this commentary back and forth. So like synthesis, he keeps thematically, this is very, very dense. And I think people can take or leave that, and that's fine. But as you're saying, Kumar, I think there's a lot of work here, and we can appreciate that.
Yeah. And there are he's come back to some themes which he's been going to the past 25 years, like language and art as magic and shared universe. I mean, he's done that a few times, and time being a solid dimension. I mean, he's come back to those wells a few times, and but all those pieces needed to be in place for this to be in the shape that it's in, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thumbs up.
Thumbs up. 3 stars out of 5.
Yeah, 3 out of. Yeah, I liked it. So, any listeners are still out there, and we haven't spoiled it rotten for you. Yeah.
It's been a couple years.
It doesn't matter if it's spoiled, because I mean, like I said, I'm going to read it a third time someday.
Yeah, exactly.
And it doesn't help because you can't even there's so much that you can't even keep it all straight through one reading. Like this second time I forgot that I forgot that HPL's parents were in the cult. That was the whole point. That was the big twist. And I'd forgotten it. And I came to it. I was like, what? And I was like shocked by it all over again. So there's no.
In fact, the moment when Black realizes is quite. It's like The Usual Suspects, where he's like his eyes widen and all these voices start appearing in his head. It's like that cinematic idea where I forgot the name of the actor, but in that moment in Usual Suspects, when he suddenly puts it all together.
It's Chaz Palminteri, I think.
Yeah, Chaz Palminteri. Thank you. And then we cut to Spacey's limp suddenly straightening out. It was quite a cinematic moment.
Yep. And let's just be glad that H.P. Lovecraft doesn't have a Twitter, because we don't know where we'd be at with this, if Providence would be allowed in our culture at all or whatever.
Is that you having a dig at J.K. Rowling?
No, anyone who's got a Twitter and would not shut up about their firm beliefs, and then it kind of radiates out to everything else that is everything else by association.
Because Moore already got his dig in at Harry Potter with the League.
Yeah. I actually, that's one thing I do really love, is that Robert Black is also a Lovecraft character. It's Robert Blake, I think, in the original. And I can't remember which story it was, but I totally love that Moore took him and made him into someone that Lovecraft would hate. That, to me, was amazing.
But again, I've mentioned it before in this conversation, but John Carpenter's The Mouth of Madness.
Yes.
When Sam Neill's character realizes he's a character.
Yeah.
And he just starts laughing.
Starts laughing in the theater. Yeah, I love that.
It's one of my favorite scenes.
Yeah.
Actually, the scene of him in the bus when he freaks out on the bus with the old ladies around him. That's my favorite scene.
Yeah.
I've got to watch that one again. I think the last time I watched it was probably 96 or something with Kumar.
It's really fun. It's a fun picture for sure. As is Reanimator, and I haven't seen the Color Out of Space, but I'll watch that once I got to get Providence out of my mind. It's really it sounds like I'm exaggerating, but it really has affected me over the past month.
Well, because we've mentioned it a few times, Color Out of Space by Richard Stanley, I think it's his first full feature since the 90s, because he had that, and there's that amazing documentary, Lost Souls, which is all about the doomed filming of The Island of Dr. Moreau, where he got fired after, I think, 2 weeks of shooting.
Yeah.
And they're filming it in Queensland here in Australia, and there's these amazing sequences where he snuck back on set disguised as one of the creatures, and he was performing magical works to curse the set and curse the filmmakers. He's a bit like Alan Moore in that sense, this sort of creative person who is fully committed to magic in a non-ironic way. Like he is a magical practitioner. And I think Color Out of Space is a very interesting film, very enjoyable riff on Lovecraft. But I also want to say that Nicolas Cage commits fully to the part, and I love what he does, and I love the empathy of Stanley for these characters. It's not going to save them, but they're fully realized characters, and there's a lot of the script is concerned with this idea of cancer and what happens to a family after cancer.
Sounds like it's much like Providence. It sounds like it's better than the original. The source material.
It's a meditation on the source material.
Right.
It's reflecting on the source material and what that might. And then Stanley apparently brought in experience of his own family with cancer to this character. This is something that's happened to his mother. So again, people taking this work and not redeeming it, but reflecting on it.
Yeah.
I think that's important. And I think that's the soul of empathy, is that you can look at the work of this man who said such horrible things and promoted and promulgated such horrible views, and then try to turn it to some good use.
Yes. And I agree with Moore that I think HPL was a visionary. And I think that idea, we need that. I don't think we want to dismiss the idea of those monsters at all.
Yeah, and I wonder if there's a working there, if there's a magical working there as well, that you try to neuter the poison, and then you try and make something good out of it through art. And maybe this is going back to this idea of magic and art and literature and idea space and blah,
and
blah, blah.
Everything Moore has done has been, taking junk and making something great out of it.
Yeah.
Providence by Alan Moore and Jacen Burrows is published by Avatar. Want to support this podcast? You can help us out by joining us on Patreon. Go to deconstructingcomics.com to connect to us on Patreon, Twitter, Facebook, or YouTube. Shop on Amazon to support the show, and to find links to subscribe to the podcast. Our theme is by J.B. Anderton. If you're looking for some constructive feedback on your comic, send it to us and Mulele and I will critique it on our spin-off podcast, Critiquing Comics. Send it to mail@deconstructingcomics.com. We'll read at least 30 pages of it and critique it on the show. Next week on Deconstructing Comics, Kumar and I put in a very emotional review of Durf's forthcoming documentary graphic novel, Kent State, about the shooting 50 years ago of 13 student protesters, 4 of whom died. I'll also be talking to Durf himself to ask him some questions that came up during our review. The book is educational and also devastating. Be sure to catch our review of it next week. Till then, this is Tim, and thanks for listening to Deconstructing Comics.